This day and time. What happened today, years ago.
Okay, let's unpack this collection of sources we've got here. We've been looking at these historical accounts, and they all center around just one day, June 20th.
Right.
But what's really fascinating, I think,
Right.
is that these aren't just, random things happening the same date. They seem connected by this really powerful, deeply human theme, survival.
Absolutely. And not just survival in one sense. We've got
Yeah.
sources covering three very different moments, different centuries, different places. There's the Black Hole of Calcutta in 1756,
Okay,
then the Tennis Court Oath in France, 1789,
right.
and the Siege of Imphal, much later, 1944. And our goal, really, in this deep dive is to understand the different kinds of survival they show us, physical, political, military, and maybe even more importantly, how the stories about these things, how they got shaped and, used long after they actually happened.
Yeah, exactly. It's like look at how these big crises or big ideas or brutal fights, they don't just change things then, but the way we tell the story becomes its own force in history. So let's jump into that first one. The one that often gets the most visceral reaction, I suppose. The Black Hole of Calcutta, June 20th, 1756. It's a story of physical survival, definitely, but maybe even more about how one story, one account that's, contested, became this powerful political weapon.
That's absolutely key. You have to picture India mid-18th century. It's a real chessboard, intense rivalry, especially Britain and France jockeying for influence.
Right.
And the British East India Company, the EIC, they were really pushing their influence in Bengal. And that inevitably brought them into conflict with the local ruler, the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah.
And the Nawab wasn't happy with what the EIC was up to.
Not at all. The EIC started building up fortifications, unauthorized ones, at Fort William in Calcutta. And on top of that, they sheltered one of the Nawab's political enemies. He saw this, quite rightly probably, as a direct challenge.
Which then escalated things pretty fast.
It did. The Nawab marched on Calcutta, Fort William fell. And that date was June 20th, 1756. And this is where that really famous and, very controversial story comes from. Mostly from one guy who said he was there, a survivor named John Zephaniah Halwell.
Okay, Halwell, so tell us about his version. What did he say happened?
Well, Halwell claimed that after the fort surrendered, the Nawab's soldiers crammed 146 British prisoners into this tiny guard room overnight. He gave dimensions like 5.5 by 4.3 meters, tiny, like a small bedroom, with only 2 small windows.
Just hearing the size sounds awful. What was the experience like, according to him?
He described, absolute horror, suffocation, obviously, a lack of air, co-Euros building up, extreme heat stroke. You've got all that body heat plus the climate, people being crushed, trampled, just because it was so packed, and, sheer panic.
And the number he claimed died.
Halwell's account states that out of 146 people shoved in there, only 23 made it out alive the next morning. So 123 deaths, a shocking number.
Just staggering. And the sources mentioned he didn't just, survive and tell people. He wrote a book, right?
He did, yes. A genuine narrative of the deplorable deaths. And this book, this story, painting the Nawab as this cruel, barbarous figure, became incredibly potent back in Britain. Real imperial propaganda.
So it wasn't just like, here's what happened. It was actively used to create a justification.
Precisely. It gave this sort of moral aura to the British cause, made it seem okay to be more aggressive. This outrage definitely helped fuel support for Robert Clive's campaigns in Bengal.
Leading to the Battle of Plassey.
Exactly, the next year, 1757. And Plassey was decisive. It essentially handed control of Bengal to the East India Company, often seen as the real start of the British Empire in India. And that black hole story was, it was central to making that power grab seem legitimate.
But I gather modern historians have pretty serious doubts about Halwell's account. The numbers, maybe other details.
Oh yes, big time. Looking at other records, the fort's layout, the estimates now are much lower, maybe closer to 64 people confined, and perhaps 21 to 43 deaths. Still awful, but very different numbers.
Right.
There's also debate about whether the Nawab even knew about it straight away, or if it was, lower-level commanders acting on their own.
So, okay, the exact details are murky, and something terrible definitely occurred. But the key takeaway is how this story, Halwell's narrative of the black hole, became this classic example of a survival story being, weaponized, twisted into a political tool to justify conquest. It's almost less about the precise fact and more about the historical effect of the telling.
Precisely. Now, let's shift gears completely. Different place, different time, different kind of survival. We're going to France, just over 30 years later, June 20th, 1789, right on the edge of the French Revolution. This is about political survival.
Okay, France back then, very rigid structure, wasn't it? These three estates.
Yeah.
Clergy, nobility, and then the third estate, which was like everyone else.
Pretty much. Merchants, lawyers, peasants, workers. About 98% of the population.
Wow.
And that 98% paid nearly all the taxes. The clergy and nobility were largely exempt, so a fundamentally unequal setup.
But things were starting to change. Ideas were spreading.
Definitely. You had Enlightenment thinkers Rousseau, Montesquieu talking about rights, popular sovereignty, how governments should work. Plus, people looked across the Atlantic. The American Revolution had just succeeded. It showed radical change was possible.
So, King Louis XVI, he calls the Estates General together in May 1789. He's hoping they'll fix France's huge money problems, right? But the Third Estate sees an opportunity.
They do. They demand a fundamental change in voting. Not voting by order, where each estate gets one vote, meaning the clergy and nobility could always outvote them 2-1. They wanted voting by head, where each representative's vote counted equally. That would give them the power, given their numbers.
And the king and the other estates refused.
They did. So the Third Estate did something incredibly bold. On June 17th, they just declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming they represented the whole nation, not just one slice of it.
Okay, that's a massive step. And then comes June 20th, 1789. What happens then?
Well, the deputies of this new National Assembly, they show up for their meeting at Versailles, and the doors are locked.
Locked, why?
Officially, it was supposedly for repairs before a royal session the king was planning. But the deputies saw it as a move by the king to shut them down, to basically dissolve them before they could gain any more ground. An attack on their political existence.
Wait, what did they do? They could have just gone home.
But they didn't. They stuck together. They marched through the streets of Versailles to a nearby building, an indoor tennis court, a jeu de paume.
Right, okay.
And there, in that sort of makeshift hall, they took an oath. A collective promise.
The famous tennis court oath.
That's the one. All but a single deputy out of the 577 there swore they would never disband until the Constitution is established and consolidated.
Wow, so it was this direct challenge, saying we are the power now, not you, king.
Exactly. It was a direct, defiant statement that political authority, sovereignty, didn't come from the monarch anymore, but from the nation, represented by them, the assembly. It was political survival in action.
And did the king try to push back?
Oh, yeah. A few days later, at that royal session on June 23rd, he ordered them to disperse, go back to voting by estate, but they refused. Famously, one deputy basically said they were there by the will of the people and would only leave at bayonet point.
Gutsy.
It was. And Louis VI eventually had to give in. On June 27th, he formally recognized the National Assembly. A huge concession.
And this moment, this oath, it wasn't just a political event, it was captured visually, wasn't it? That famous sketch by Jacques-Louis David.
Yes. David's sketch is incredible. It's pure political theater, almost propaganda in its own way, but for the revolution. He shows everyone laser-focused on Bailey, the president, reading the oath at the center, and you see these amazing symbols, like a Catholic priest embracing a Protestant minister, showing national unity over religious divides. You see ordinary citizens cheering wildly from the windows above, connecting the assembly to the people.
And there's that detail of the wind, right? Blowing the curtains.
Yeah. It feels like this revolutionary wind is sweeping through the place. David totally elevates this moment of political survival, this act of defiance, into something almost sacred, a foundational myth for the new France.
So it marks the point where this idea, popular sovereignty, stops being just philosophy and starts becoming, well, real political power in Europe. The people saying, we're in charge now.
Okay, let's shift again. Fast forward to 1944, June 20th again, World War II. We're on the Burma front, jungles, mountains, a totally different kind of survival, military survival on a huge scale.
Right. The Japanese had this major plan, didn't they?
Yeah.
Operation Yugo. What was the goal there?
The goal was audacious. Invade India, cut the Allies' main supply line into China, and crucially, capture the big Allied base at Imphal. They needed Imphal's supplies, fuel, food, ammo to keep their own offensive going. They had about 85,000 troops involved.
And who were the commanders?
The Japanese push was under Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi. He had this almost fanatical belief in the fighting spirit of his soldiers, maybe sometimes ignoring the hard realities of logistics.
Okay.
Facing him was the Allied commander, Lieutenant General William Slim, a very different character, pragmatic, strategically sharp, and really focused on supply lines.
So the Japanese attack starts in March 44, a surprise push. How did the Allies respond?
Well, Slim didn't just try to hold a long line. He had his forces pull back and consolidate into defensive boxes around Imphal, but they also had to hold this absolutely critical outpost further north at Kohima. If Kohima fell, Imphal was completely cut off.
And Kohima, this is where we get that really strange, chilling echo of the French story.
It is. Unbelievably, some of the most savage, desperate fighting at Kohima happened literally on and around the tennis court that belonged to the deputy commissioner's bungalow.
Wait, another tennis court turned into a battlefield. That's just eerie.
It really is. Accounts describe soldiers fighting hand-to-hand across the net, chucking grenades back and forth at point-blank range. A place meant for, leisure becomes this absolute killing field. It really symbolized how brutal and close quarters that fight was.
But holding out at Imphal and Kohima, it wasn't just about grit on the ground, was it? There was something else, something crucial for the Allies.
Oh, absolutely critical. It was air power and logistics. Slim and the Allies relied massively on a huge air supply operation, codename Operation Stamina.
Operation Stamina, literally feeding the fight from the sky.
Exactly. The scale, when you look at the sources, is pretty staggering. They flew in 19,000 tons of supplies, food, ammo, everything into these surrounded areas.
Okay.
Plus, 12,000 fresh troops flown in, and maybe just as important, 13,000 wounded and sick flown out. This air bridge kept the whole Allied force, about 155,000 troops in total in the region, supplied and fighting, even though they were cut off on the ground.
And meanwhile, the Japanese, Mutaguchi had banked on capturing Allied supplies,
Right.
not on bringing his own.
That was the fatal flaw in his plan. When they couldn't capture Imphal quickly and their own supply lines back through the jungle were incredibly long and difficult, they started to starve. They ran out of ammo, medicine, everything.
So faced with that and relentless Allied pressure,
They were eventually forced into retreat. It started around July 3rd, 1944, and horrifically, it was right in the middle of the monsoon season. Pouring rain, mud everywhere.
and the cost of that retreat must have been terrible.
Devastating. Just catastrophic for the Japanese. Out of those initial forces, they suffered something like 60,643 casualties. And the awful thing is, most didn't die in battle. They died from starvation, from diseases like malaria and dysentery, just pure exhaustion on the retreat. The trails became known grimly as the White Bone Road.
Just awful. So this wasn't just a defeat, it was Japan's biggest land defeat of the entire war, wasn't it? A real turning point in Burma.
Absolutely. It starkly showed the clash of military thinking. Mutaguchi's faith and spirit over matter just couldn't overcome the Allied advantage in industrial logistics, supply, and crucially control of the air. A brutal lesson in what military survival meant in modern warfare.
And the memory's complex too, right? The British forgotten army, the Japanese view it as this terrible disaster. And then in India, it's complicated by Indian soldiers fighting on both sides.
Very complex legacies, yes.
So, okay, we've got these three stories, all June 20th, all about survival. But wow, such different context, different kinds of survival.
Yeah, you've got the raw physical survival in the black hole, a story that then gets twisted into imperial justification. Then the political survival, that assertion of national will on a tennis court in France, challenging centuries of absolute monarchy.
Right.
And finally, this grinding military survival in Burma, where modern logistics and air power ultimately decided who endured and who collapsed.
And what really strikes me, listening to all this, beyond the date, beyond even the survival theme, is the power of the story itself. How these events get told, who tells them, how they're depicted like David's painting it, has such a massive impact later on.
Absolutely. The narrative becomes a force in itself. And, you know, that weird, uncanny coincidence of the two tennis courts, June 20th, centuries apart. One sees the birth of a nation's political will. The other becomes this hellish battlefield. It's almost symbolic of the different arenas where these life or death struggles play out.
It really shows us, doesn't it, how crises, big ideas, major conflicts, they're not just dots on a timeline. The stories we build around them, they shape how we understand the world, how politics unfolds.
Which kind of brings us to a final thought, maybe for you, the listener, to take away. Think about the stories of survival you hear about today. They could be personal stories, overcoming illness or hardship. They could be political movements fighting for recognition or whole communities enduring disaster.
Yeah.
How are those stories being told? Are they just straightforward accounts of endurance? Or are they perhaps being shaped, maybe subtly, maybe not so subtly, into something more? Are they being used to build a case, to justify something, to influence how you see things? It's just something to keep in mind as you navigate the narratives all around us.
Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more history daily.